Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'll give everyone a few moments to come in. I had a technical glitch for a nanosecond, so I will check to make sure I see us somewhere. And if you see us somewhere, say hello in the chat. Let me know where you're from. All right, good. I see us on Facebook. I see us online. Let's hopefully, all right. Angela from the UK saying hello. So we're live in the UK. That's a good sign.
Mhm.
All right, everyone, I'll give it just a few moments. BJ, good to see you. Excited to
Good to
talk.
see you, David.
All right, welcome everyone. I'll give everyone just a few moments to come in. All right, and this is maybe before your time, BJ, but there was a thing years ago when I was growing up called Romper Room.
Oh, I remember Romper Room.
And the teacher would pretend like she sees everyone. So in our virtual world, I pretend like I see everyone. So Vivian's here from New York. Hi, Vivian. Cheryl's here from Maryland. Deborah from Los Angeles. Jackie's here. Lucia from Vegas. Signe from Norway. Hi, Colleen from Grand Rapids. All right, let's see. Kentucky, Connecticut. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see everyone coming on. Cindy's from Westport, Maine. All right. Christine's from Illinois. Glad to see everyone coming on. Welcome. Amy from Miami. All right. Looks like we're going everywhere, so that's a good sign.
Mhm.
All right. Well, for any of you who may be new to the group, this is a group. I'm David Kessler. You're going to meet BJ Miller here in a moment. This is a group that I set up after COVID. In March, the grief groups were all shut down. People obviously were unable to see their loved one who were dying, unable to have funerals. And we decided if we can't physically be together, we're going to virtually be together. And so this is my free grief group. It's also my Tender Hearts group. So a number of people combined here that are watching, and many of you will watch this in the replay. So as you all know, one of the things I like to always do is just start with a moment of silence. You know, I'm a big believer that when our loved ones die, we don't quit loving them and they don't quit loving us. So just a moment of silence to honor and connect with them, if you would. Thank you so much. All right, let's see. Lynn's here from Minnesota, New Mexico, Australia. Welcome all. Good to see you. So I'm really excited to talk to Dr. BJ Miller today. Nice to see you again. And many people know your work from Zen Hospice or from the Oprah show or from your book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, which, by the way, I love that title. Who's not a beginner when it comes to life and everything we deal with? You know, I have a number of questions, and we have questions that came in ahead of time. I want to start with something I found interesting. When I told a few people, not in this group, when I told people you were coming, they're like, yeah, we love him. Some people in our worlds said to me, well, he does palliative care, he doesn't do grief. Or they said, isn't he a palliative care doctor? And I thought about that because it's something that I've gotten over the years, straddling my work in hospice and palliative care and grief, and this crazy notion that there's somehow a disconnection or a choice we make. And seems like in life, it's a continuum that's not
Amen.
even linear.
Yeah, I'm super with you. And yeah, and that's a funny response. I mean, A, we all have access to grief. B, our field does explicitly say that the purview extends beyond the patient's life into the family's life and beyond death into grief for the family. And as you and I both know, that grief starts before death anyway. So for all sorts of reasons.
Right. We talk about that as, sorry, didn't manage to take my phone off there.
It's a good reminder, brother. Hold on.
Good reminder, exactly, exactly. And I was told you could have animals, as I could too. I have a dog,
Yep.
so anyone's welcome. You
There's
know,
Maisie.
let me see again.
There's
Oh,
Maisie
how
over there.
cute, how cute. So, you know, I think about that arbitrary line that we think is there that obviously isn't.
Mhm.
And I am a big believer in discussing anticipatory grief and talking about early grief and then mature grief. And I think, you know, people are always shocked when I say early grief is 2 years. We have a society that often wants to say, no, early grief is the first week, but that's not the world we live in.
Mm-mm.
You know, we had a discussion the other day in the Tender Hearts group that I thought was an interesting one. And it was about the idea of we need to make time for grief. But I also talk about grief needs dedicated time, but not always a lot.
Mhm.
And what's interesting about the conversation we ended up happening that I'd love to get your take on is, can we make a mistake? Not that there's any real mistakes in grief, but
Mm.
can giving it too much time, and I'll just use myself as an example.
Mhm.
After my younger son died, I canceled lectures and everything for 6 weeks. And at about a month, I said, so do I just sit here in the pain doing nothing?
Mhm.
This is hideous. And are those distractions? Is work, is sort of the going in and out of grief helpful? Have you thought about that concept and how it might relate to suffering?
Well, yeah, and I think we can cling to our grief, our sufferings, our miseries. I think it is possible in a way to. I'm gonna be clumsy with language because I don't know that
Okay.
there are words for a lot of what we do, but I suppose we can over-identify with our pain. Um, and so what would that look like? And as you said, David, there's really no right or wrongs here. So I guess the question always comes back to, is it serving you? So is me really identifying with my disability, say, or the loss of my sister is a real part of my identity and how I think about myself in the world. Oh, fine. Those are big things, better that than hair color or jawline or, whatever other ways we identify ourselves. Um, yeah, I suppose though it can get tricky if it's starting to get in the way of the rest of your life, crowd other things out. Um, I suppose that's the metric. I don't know that. I'm just thinking out
Right.
loud together, but I have much of the time I spend with folks and myself is trying to help us pay attention to our grief, pay attention to our suffering. And so I do realize I'm usually trying to point people
Right.
towards their pain. And I'm coming from a place that is because we usually don't give it enough credit. We don't give it enough space or time. So I'm often in this trying to make up for it by pushing people towards it. But as you say that, I have met people and I have found myself in these zones where I think sometimes I'm overdoing it. And last thing I'll say about it is I think the trick is not the trick, or I think the point is to integrate our grief with the rest of our life, not barricade around it.
Right. And I think, you know, the distinction that's shifted in this new world we're in the pandemic
Mm.
is sometimes when I say to people, you know, you've got to make time for your grief, they're like, I am sitting here out of work, isolated, alone. My husband's dead, my wife, and there's nothing but pain, David.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in those cases, it is a strange world that we live in a society, like you said, that usually doesn't give it enough.
Right.
And now people have been shoved into being so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting. I would love for you to take a moment or two and just tell us about you, how you got into this world. And then
Hmm.
I want to go to a few more questions that have come in already.
Yeah, and I will. I'd love to. And I just want to sort of pick up on what you just said too, and then we'll circle back to it. I think, like anything else, there's time with anything that can be relatively quality time, or it can be,
Right, right.
it can be
That's a
going
good
in
way. Have
circles time.
quality time with your grief.
Yeah. Versus just sitting there and banging your head against the wall or whatever,
Right.
or deep in a well of anger and not seeing anything but that. So,
And that's exactly, I said, pay attention to the woman who we're talking to. I said, pay attention to your thinking. Is it ruminating? Is
mm,
it circular thinking? If that's it, that isn't serving you.
yeah,
So I think that makes perfect sense what you're saying.
yeah, good. We're together. So for me, God, yeah. So hi, I came to this work, and when I say this work, I'm saying now palliative care, my profession, I suppose is the way to put it, my vocation. I got injured in college when I was 19, sophomore in college, and lost 3 limbs to electrical burns. And happy to talk about any of the details of that, but that was a big moment in my life, obviously, and that delivered me to healthcare. And it was, I was saved by healthcare. I got amazing support in all sorts of ways, and I was fascinated by that experience. And so I got really sort of turned on by what healthcare could be, and I was also deeply aware of where healthcare doesn't serve us so well. So I had got this sort of line of sight into its pros and cons, and just became very interested in it. So that kind of teased me around healthcare and medicine in general. But after, it took me a while to think about it, if I really wanted to do that kind of work. And I came around to it again after college and went back and took the pre-meds. I majored in art history and did other things with my mind at that time. Then I circled back to it, not out of a love of healthcare or medicine, but a love of humans. And it was the same kind of interest that drove me to studying art, that drove me to studying medicine. It's just looking at humans and human beings and human relationships just from sort of different lenses. So, and I also, the other point there is that I had inherited a sort of a relatively a newer take on disability, thanks to the disability rights movement, where it was no compliment to look beyond my disability. It was, my disability is part of my life. It's part of who I am. I'm not interested in putting it behind me because I can't put it behind me. So it's not something to overcome, rather it's something to use, and something to texture our thoughts and our feelings, etc. So I knew I wanted to work from those experiences that I had, and that also pointed me back to healthcare. So anyway, that's how I got into medicine. And then through medicine, I actually became disillusioned deep into medical school. I thought I was going to do rehab medicine, and then fell out of love with that for a number of reasons. And I was going to drop out of medicine altogether. I knew I had come close enough to death to know that I wasn't going to just sign up to sacrifice my life to work that I didn't care about. But I then stumbled onto palliative care during an elective in my internship, and fell immediately in love with the subject in the field. And then that's what I've done, off to the races.
Wonderful. I think that it is interesting how so many people sort of talk about it as I do, that, it's not an elective we just sort of look at. There's something that sort of resonates in us.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said in the chat, and it's always something I like to address right up front. I had a bad experience with hospice. Hospice is bad. And I want to get your take on that, because here's what I always say to people whenever I hear that. I always say, first of all, I'm so sorry that the experience isn't what they had hoped for. And it's an interesting world that there's no other industry. If I had a bad experience at the restaurant on the corner, I would never say, that's it, restaurants are bad, or hotels bad. Hospice, and it's unfortunate, there is mediocre hospice out there. There's great hospice, just like anything else. If you don't have a good experience, people do tend to think hospice bad. And it's not a black and white topic like that.
Right on. That's much my response too. I think there's so much misunderstanding around hospice and palliative care, for that matter. And sometimes I think that people think there is a national organization called hospice. So if they had a bad experience in Lansing, Michigan, that is a comment on hospice in general. But to your point, no. Hospice is an industry, is a discipline, is a many things. So there's good hospice.
It's like, right, hospitals and doctors and everything else.
Everything else where humans are involved anyway. So so that's absolutely true. I think another thing worth pointing out is I think a lot of the early hospice work that you know so well too, like, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, then it really, I think, when I've gone into the field too, I think a lot of folks early on went into hospice because of a vocation, a feeling of, wow, this is a calling, not just a job. And I'll speak for the medical side. I'd say the last 10, 15 years in my experience, I'm meeting more and more people going into this field who didn't really have a calling. It's so maybe they liked the hours, or it was less intensive in some ways than maybe intensive care, or they were coming to the field for different reasons. All fine, it's not me to judge, but I have noticed a change in some of the spirit of the work. And then another point too is, in the last, how many years, maybe 10 years or so, almost all the growth in the industry is in the for-profit sector. Now, that doesn't mean for-profit doesn't make you bad and non-profit doesn't make you good. I've had, I want to be very clear there. Right. But that does point us to why other industries are getting into the hospice work is for financial reasons, not necessarily heart-driven reasons. And so anyway, so it always pays to interview a few hospices if possible. And if things aren't going, register that complaint. You might be able to get a different team involved, et cetera. And I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to make one more point, David. Sorry, I'm babbling.
Okay, you're good.
I also think, and this is whoever in the chat was making these points, please, I want to be careful here. You may have really had just crummy care, and I am very sorry about that. I will also say, as is in the just generic conversation, I do meet folks who there can be something of a shoot the messenger phenomenon, that there's so much heartache and pain and sorrow around the death of a loved one, period, for some folks, that I think oftentimes I'm getting the sense that they're focusing their ire on the hospice agency when oftentimes it was just the fact that someone died can be the source of the pain. So there's some of that too.
And there's a third option in there worth mentioning that I would often see, and that is, your loved one's going to fight this. They're going to beat it. They're going to make it. Mm-hmm. Gone. Julie comes in from hospice, and it is a little bit of shoot the messenger, but it's also that we did such a poor job preparing this person that we went for this poor family from cheering them on to a cure to, sorry, consolation prize hospice.
Yeah.
And they're like, what?
Right.
I think that's gotten so many people too. That's certainly a challenge.
Yep. Amen. And with that late referral, sorry here, guys, that's amazing. Okay. Sending her love. And oftentimes I'll hear that hospice nurse killed my father, because he died just minutes after he got an injection from the nurse of a medication. So there's always so that I've heard that many times.
And let me tell you, I do a lot of work, and I did a lot of discussion about that in Finding Meaning, the book, the last one I wrote, about how to scientifically challenge some of those concepts. And we do a lot of that in here to really look at what's true.
Great.
That sort of brings me to one of the next concepts I wanted to ask you about that I think I see so often. When a loved one dies, and I think sometimes when there hasn't been the proper lead up, we become filled with something went wrong. Mm-hmm. Just like you said, the doctor didn't come to hospice. The doctor didn't round that day. The nurse did this, didn't draw his labs.
Mhm.
And I'll say, well, wait a minute, why were they in a hospice? Oh, well, they were in stage 4 advanced cancer. And I'm like, you're ignoring the cancer and
Mhm.
saying it was because the nurse didn't do the labs.
Yeah.
So what do you think that is about our mind?
Mm.
Control, what is it that makes us want to find fault versus understanding there is a time we die and no
Mhm.
one wants that ever?
Well, this I think gets at least in part, that the why you and I and so many others increasingly are sort of trying to help everyone realize that death is part of life, not a failing, not something that went wrong. It is a life going right, includes dying. And so if we can really get at that root, and as a country, as people, can wrap our heads around the idea that death is not a failing, well, then maybe we'll be less likely to be looking for blame at the end, because we will not have absorbed this idea that death happens when something goes wrong. So I think that's a huge, huge piece of it. And then a second piece, I think this psychology of humans, it's very helpful to have an enemy. It's very useful to have something to blame. It's very satisfying if it's real. And so sometimes we'll hunt for something to blame if something's going on that's just unfathomable, something that makes us feel so hard. It's such a hard thing to wrap our head around. And I do see this happening a lot of times. We can't deal with that huge fire that is life and death. So we'll make some smaller fires that we can have some control, that there's a good narrative, that has a good guy and a bad guy. That supposition, or putting some sort of structure around it to make it sensible, logical, rational, and we have a nice little narrative, that helps us digest big things. The problem is that can pull us to non-truths and half-truths too easily.
Right. So I have a few questions that came in that I thought if you're up for it, we would go over some
Yeah,
of them. Okay.
please.
And feel free to write them on Facebook, to put them in the chat here. Lucia says, it's been difficult to let go of the air hunger that my husband struggled with in his final hours. Can you recommend help to us? I wonder if there's anything I could have done. Are there books to help you deal? Yes, I'm sure there is. Yours, mine, and a few other great ones. I'm looking forward to this talk with Dr. Miller.
Mm.
I don't think we know what death looks like before we actually see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you say to people who see death and certainly go, I can't get that image out of my mind?
Mm.
The air hunger or the look in their eyes or whatever
Mhm.
it may be for them.
Mhm. You know, to your point, I think it's important that we don't make stuff up, you know, to try to just smooth something over. And very often we have to honestly say, I don't know. I don't know what your husband, your brother, your daughter, whoever was feeling in those final moments. But it's my sense that as a physician, as someone who's been around dying people a lot of the time, and just understanding physiology, that in the final hours, the the hardest role really is very often for us seems to be for us onlookers. So the person who's actually doing the dying, and no matter what their body looks like and signals that you may read from the rest of life, can be very different in the dying process. And it may very well have been that your husband or whoever was nowhere near feeling what you were witnessing, and that it was much harder for you than for him. And that's just I can't prove that, but that's my sense from being around a lot of deathbeds.
I tell an embarrassing story
Mm.
of years ago. You know, we talk about, it's called the agonal phase of dying,
Mhm.
which I think is just a hideous phrase and name for it. I was on a plane, bored, walking up and down the aisle trying to stretch. And I swear it looked like someone stopped breathing and it was like literally was having air hunger. And I just tapped them and I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, because things happen on planes. I've, been part of that. And I was like, what? And I tell people, watch your loved ones sleep. It's not
Mhm.
pretty either. I
Yeah.
mean, we often don't know that what you see at the end of life sometimes looks like some of those things we do when we're sleeping, but
Mhm.
we're not used to seeing it. I would love to hear your take. I think we all have words we use to talk about it. I talk about, because someone said, what's quality grief? I think about, I've just made that term up, but uh, pure grief, the
Mhm.
pain, to me, the pain of my loved one, that's part of the love. And then for me, there's another thing called suffering that my mind complicates grief with. A parent, your child shouldn't have died, all those kind of things.
Mhm.
How do you talk about suffering? How would you explain
Mm.
suffering to us that you've experienced?
So it's an important point. I think we all often mean slightly different things by these big words. I mean, the definition that I've been sort of using for a while is that suffering is a gap or a wedge that opens up inside of us that and the gap is between the world or the reality that we want and the reality that we have. And put more simply, like you can simply say, suffering is when you wish your life were otherwise, deeply, intensely wish reality were otherwise. In other words, it's suffering is this thing that puts you at odds with reality. And a lot of us, I think, are fueled by a low level of suffering. It can be a force that wills us to change the world, change our reality, to close that gap. So sometimes a little bit of suffering can kind of spur us to action. But anyway, that's sort of getting farther afield. But anyway, that's how I define suffering and describe it. And to me, that runs the risk of being a little light. Um, but I'd rather run that risk and us become much more familiar with our own suffering and how we do it on a big scale and a little scale. So I'm happy enough with that definition for now, anyway.
Right. And I think it's a challenging definition for people in grief.
Mhm.
And, I'll speak to only my own experience that certainly there were years I got into this field because of my mother dying in a shooting and all that.
Mhm.
She wasn't supposed to die. And of
Mhm.
course, I spent years in angst and she wasn't supposed to die. I learned, much like you talk about, there is a freedom found in reality.
Mhm.
And that freedom helps with the suffering. Doesn't bring her back,
Mhm.
doesn't make the loss okay. And now, years later with my own son, it is the same thing.
Mhm.
Sitting in the this shouldn't have happened is, of course, something I think all of us early on in grief, there's no all, but many of us, of course, have to go through this shouldn't have happened.
Mhm.
And there is a wrestling that I think we have to do, little bits of acceptance with, and this did happen.
Mhm.
And that reality is eventually where the suffering can decrease.
Yep. Yeah.
Is
Amen.
that
And it
sort of
feels
along the lines of,
totally. Yes. And so I think it's really helpful in that way. And so I love how you talk, David. There's in all these things, so much of this stuff is on a spectrum or a continuum. It's not like, are you suffering or not?
right,
It's to what degree are we suffering? Probably the same with grief. I would imagine, especially the way we can be so connected to so many people now, I would imagine most of us are in grief much or all of the time,
right,
some amount of it. So I think it's so helpful how you lay things out on a spectrum. And I think that's true of suffering too. And what seems like a subtle shift of saying this shouldn't have happened to I wish this hadn't happened, you know, makes a big difference. But it's a small difference. But experientially, it makes a lot of qualitatively, it makes a lot of difference.
right. And I think we don't realize the suffering is the fight.
Mhm.
And I would never turn to anyone early in grief and ever say, but it did happen, except, I mean, I would
Yeah.
never do that. So don't think I'm saying that. Whenever I use words like denial or acceptance, I always like to remind people, with Kubler-Ross, the stages, she and I said they're not linear and all that. So I always like to remind people, not a map, not linear, all that good stuff. A number of questions have come in from so many people. There's many, many, many people in this group, a large proportion who are dealing with this. What guidance would you have for those of us who are not able to be with a loved one when they died to COVID or to something else during this period?
First of all, like you're saying earlier, David. First of all, there's no. I'm so sorry. There's no. Let's not spin that as, oh, that's not a big deal. But I find it helpful to point out a couple things these days around dying. One is that when I hear people say, I lost a cousin to COVID, and if only I could have been there, then I think then I would be at peace, or then I would have had closure, etc. And there's a time and a place to push back on anyone's thoughts or statements, but I think it's very much worth noting that pre-COVID, when I've been around families who could be at the bedside and families for whatever reason who couldn't be at the bedside, everyone's still left. Closure is a made-up thing, is in my view. Like it's a useful thing.
I don't believe in closure, by the way.
Yeah, I don't even know. I mean, it can be a useful thing to kind of for your own narrative, right, but it doesn't really exist. And so I would really challenge that this would be so much easier if you could have been at the bedside. I think for us living on, we're always left with the charge of making meaning from a bunch of things that we can't control and that we wish were otherwise, even under the best of circumstances. So not to talk anybody out of the pain of being separate away from each other at times like this, but just to temper it a little bit. I don't think it would make all the difference. So that's a big point. And then related is, this is a very important time for us in all sorts of ways, including our tuning our muscle of going inward. These days in Western life, there's so many distractions. There's so much energy on our phones. There's so much activity all the time. Actually, the art of going inward is a, I don't know, it's dying art, but it's endangered. Has been in recent years, and right now, that is what I think a lot of us are being called to, is to go to our lives inside. And I think once we're in there, you realize that's where these relationships live all the time. That's where my relationship to my parents, who are both alive, whether I'm with them in person or 2,000 miles away, I'm still very often responding to the relationship is in me. I'm often responding inwardly. So I would just say to call people's attention to, just because you can't be in someone's company, think of them, go there. Like you summoned us at the beginning of this session to think of people we've lost. Go inward to that place inside of us. That's a very rich place, and that's not bound by geography or time. And so that might help break up this idea that we're so removed from one another.
And I think you and I have the experience that before COVID, it wasn't like everyone got to be there. I mean, before COVID, people were mad that they were at the grocery stores, they were at work, they were down the hall talking to the doctor. I mean, I always say that moment is out of control. And just like you said, I'm in no way minimizing the robbing of that opportunity that people are not getting.
Yeah.
And I always say, they died with all of your love.
Yeah.
They died with all of your love.
And I will add one more little note to that too. It's not uncommon that people, I've seen so many deathbed vigils where families so want to be there for those final moments that they don't sleep. They just sit there and stare at their loved one in the bed. They don't leave the room. They don't go to the bathroom. They don't go outside. They don't sleep. And it can go on for hours and days. And it's like, and then there so often happens is right when that person leaves the room to go to the bathroom or whatever it is, they finally leave the room. And that's very often when the person dies. I don't know why that is, but it's a thing. It's a pattern I and you and many of us have noted. So on some level, again, not to minimize anything, but just to temper all this. On some level, many of us need to actually be alone at that dying moment, it seems.
Right. Karen asks, what's your opinion on suffering and the death of a family member by death by suicide? It's so easy to blame yourself for missing something or not recognizing the signs early enough to prevent it.
Well, I can jump in there, David. I lost my sister to suicide, and it,
Will you tell
I
us your
think,
sister's name, your first name?
yeah, Lisa.
Lisa,
Lisa.
thank you.
Lisa was my one sibling, my older sister. She died when I was 29, and she was 32, almost 33. So this was about 20 years ago. Um, and I think it's very dangerous to compare sufferings. But I do think that suicide, when someone chooses to leave the planet, it does bring a different. There's some details that go with that notion that can make it pretty challenging, and it certainly has for me. It feels different when I meet elders who've had that full life and have done their work and love life, don't want to die, but are ready to go. And then we get to console each other around the fact that this just has to be, and isn't that sad? But what do we do when death is actually asked for, when death is requested, when death is actually better than life? I mean, it can upend a lot of the things we say and think about it. And it just, all I can do here is acknowledge that it has its particular difficulties. And I, like so many family members who or know or love someone who killed themselves, it is, I have for years dealt with this idea: what could I have done? What should I have done? If I have a slew of regrets of how I spent my last moments with her, etc. And all I can do over time, it's gotten a little easier by just tempering that voice with the fact that, well, it was her choice. She left, and on some level, do I know she loved me? Yeah. Am I hurt she left me? Yeah. Do I think she left me? No. I don't think that was what was driving her. And it's just taken me a long time to actually answer some of my own questions that invariably come up. So all I can say is it's really hard, and it takes a long, long time. And yeah, I don't know that I have much more wisdom than that.
And I would add to that what we're learning about brain science
Hmm.
is telling us that it might not even be as much a choice
Hmm.
as the result of a mind or a brain that was misfiring
Hmm.
and had wiring difficulties.
Yeah.
And for anyone watching, I just also want to mention, if you go to griefsuicide.com, I have a 3-part free class there. Who's anyone who's had that type of death, because there are certainly some differences. That's at griefsuicide.com. So check that out, because it's a painful thing to have to deal with. Shirley says, my husband passed 6 days after being in a hospice facility. I would sit, hold, and rub his hand. The nurse came in one day and asked me to stop doing that because it was stimulating. I regret that I stopped it. They just kept increasing the morphine. So what was the point?
Yeah, hard to say without having been there, of course, what that hospice nurse was thinking. I did reference earlier that sometimes when folks can be, you would have known this, sometimes the stimulation can be agitating. So if talking to or touching someone who's in the throes of dying is causing them to be restless, it's changing their breathing pattern, furrow brow, we often might counsel someone to sort of read the person's body in real time. And if it seems to be agitating, then back off a little bit. That's very different than, hey, don't touch your loved one. And I can't quite, obviously, I can't speak to what your husband what he was showing at that time. I hope you didn't get some sort of thoughtless, generic reflex by a hospice nurse who didn't know enough to kind of parse when is stimulation good thing or maybe a less good thing. And that going up and up on the morphine very often to treat shortness of breath or pain at the end of life does require going up and up on the morphine. I hope that that nurse wasn't actually trying to hasten the person's death, because that's not legal or ethical. So hard to really say exactly what was going on there in that situation, but that I just wanted to spell out why we sometimes find ourselves giving that counsel.
Right. This is an interesting one. Catherine says, just before my partner died, his breathing changed to, I think it's sniffling, and snuffling, and two tears rolled down his cheek. I'm haunted by that. And also that I learned afterwards that hearing is thought to be preserved late in the dying process. And I regret talking about dying in front of him.
You know, I hear you. And whether those were tears of sorrow, of joy, of love, or some sort of reflex, whether they had given him medications that make his eyes water, it could have been many, many things. And like we were saying earlier, you who lives on, there is some flexibility in how you might read that situation. And I guess I would encourage you to read it in a way that obviously feels right to you, but also that serves you. I would imagine there was a lot of love between you. And even if someone does all the work and prepares for dying and understands that it's part of life and blah, 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 there's still plenty of reason and room for tears. Tears aren't an enemy. So and I also have had this experience that I've counseled families, yes, that hearing is often we think of as one of the last things to go. So keep that in mind as you're in the room with someone. But I also have generally encouraged family to just talk honestly, talk about dying, talk about them, talk about their life. Because in my experience, the dying person knows better than we know. The dying person knows what's going on in ways that we can't. So I don't think we need to tiptoe around the dying person so much. I think we can extend. They have wisdom that we don't in those moments, and my sense is they'd know how to hear you.
I also started out years ago in Children's Hospital here in Los Angeles, and I always think of sort of lessons from the children I learned. And it's interesting how they would talk about, we've got the issue with dying. They can talk about it, their parents can't. So, and I would say to this person, I always ask, as you've heard me say before, what might the story your mind be making up around this? That it sounds like you might have a story, which could absolutely be true, that your husband was going to have a blissful death and you said the D word and you caused, his bliss to go away. And I don't know that I would believe that is true. Not that it couldn't be, but just to maybe think about that. If, as we said early on, does that story serve you? I think we can make up stories that can really, as we talked about, cause more suffering.
Often, I will tell a quick story. I met a man at a conference once who wanted to talk to me and review his mom's death. And so I'll keep it short. We went through, so tell me about the story, what happened, blah, blah, blah. And essentially, his mom's death, his mom had talked to all the family members about how she wanted to die, had documented her wishes. Everything in the family honored every wish that she'd ever stated. Everyone knew there was no confusion around it. It could not have been, in some ways, a better death insofar as it went according to what she had hoped for. And this man, this was about 2 years in, and he wanted to review this with me because he was sure that he was to be blamed somewhere. Like he just couldn't. He in his mind he caused her death. And as we reviewed it, there was just took me a while to understand what he was telling me, and I was just use this as a story to remind myself, and that I watch myself do this. Is like we were saying earlier about blame. Beyond just blame, we're really good at turning that gun on ourselves. I
Right.
mean, most of us get really, when there's any doubt, we'll blame ourselves for the first, when there's any doubt, even if there isn't any doubt, there's something satisfying about blaming ourselves. So I just offer that up just to check yourself if that's what you're doing. Are you hell bent on seeing you're being at fault in some way? Does that make somehow this tie to your story?
Well, I want to combine two questions that'll be our last ones here, and I've so appreciated your time.
It's a pleasure.
Gil and Sarah, two different ways. I'll give you both questions. I think they connect. Gil says, what is for you the difference between death by suicide and the decision to end cancer treatment, knowing it causes death or causes an earlier death? And then Susan says, Sarah, does anyone else feel guilty for authorizing comfort care? I think those kind of relate a little bit, but I'd love to hear your take on those. And obviously I got stuff to say.
Yeah, and I want to hear yours too, buddy. Yeah. So, I'll start with the second question. Do I ever feel guilty for authorizing comfort care?
And I think
I
they were
don't know.
talking about them as the family, but
Oh,
you,
I see. Yeah. Okay.
right,
Yeah.
not you, but them, but your perspective is still important.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, yeah. So as a physician, as a person who then, when I saw that word authorize, I'm sort of signing the orders for comfort care kind of thing. But so, I have not felt, so there's a different question that you're probably asking. I have not felt guilty for authorizing comfort care, but I guess I point us back to, is it consistent, with the person's wishes, most importantly, and is it just consistent with reality? Is the end coming no matter what? And eking out some comfort and peace in the final moments, even if you don't, if you want to fight illness tooth and nail, when that fight is obviously over, there's some real power to comfort care, and it can oftentimes give a moment of reprieve, a moment where that person feels anything but pain to actually connect, etc. So, but especially if that person had requested, or if that was their wishes for comfort care, then amen. But now, what was your first question, David? Because I want to make sure to open this up right.
Let me give you my take on that too.
Yeah.
Well, they actually relate. The first one was about, is ending treatment another form of death by suicide? And what I would say to the person about comfort care is, decades ago, I talked about Marcus Welby. If you watched him on TV, he was the TV doctor. He practically told you when it was time to get married and have kids. And he also told you when it was time to die. And that was sort of our paternalistic way to practice medicine. The problem is we moved into this world where it's about individual choice, which is so wonderful. However, there is a time that the body begins to die. And if we, out of that, presenting a menu, do you want another chemo or do you want comfort care? I think it gives you the illusion there's really a choice in what this body will do. And that body is going to die, whether they're in comfort or in chemo. That's sort of my take on that.
Yes, that is so beautifully put. Amen. It is very often presented as a choice, which I think we in the healthcare do families a disservice by. We think choice is freedom and we all want choice, but actually not always. Choice can be a big pain in the ass, especially when it's a false choice. Presented in this way to give the illusion that you have some freedom and some agency because we think that implies something good or powerful. But in fact, it's very often not really a choice at all, like you're saying, David. And otherwise, I think on this bigger question, this earlier question about stopping chemo and is that a kind of a suicide? I do think there's a meaningful distinction between getting out of the way of death and inserting the blade, actually ending the life with your own will. And so I think there's a meaningful distinction between those two things. And that brings up, like you guys had said, you and some other folks in the chat had pointed out around suicide. Is that really a choice? Because it's tempting to say, well, someone who commits suicide makes this choice and actually inserts the blade metaphorically
And the
and
more we
ends its
study
life.
it, the more we know they weren't choosing death. They were trying to manage pain that
Yeah.
became intolerable.
Yeah. So in some ways, there may not be such a difference between these two things if we see them as getting out of the way of something that was going to happen anyway. Last point to make on that for me anyway is that suicide, as language goes, gets loaded up and laden with its own baggage. And suicide has a negative pejorative connotation. And so you'll notice why, like states who have assisted dying laws, aid in dying laws, that used to be called physician assisted suicide. We dropped that word to get away from the baggage, so that the idea is someone is choosing suffering versus getting out of the way of death. But that may also end up being a meaningless distinction as we learn more and more about suicide and choice anyway.
Right. And, just like there's someone else made a comment on Facebook, I ended resuscitation on the phone. I'm still traumatized. When they asked me, I regret saying, yes, you can stop. There's almost an illusion we get in that call that if you didn't say yes, your loved one would be here and fine. And I often ask people about, well, what was going on that was everything underlying that there's even a resuscitation on the table? Because it isn't like they would be here fine.
Yeah. And also this pushback on the TV notion that resuscitation is usually brings people back. Most of the time it doesn't bring people back. And most of the time we've just spent their final moments in a frenzy of futile activity and sometimes somewhat painful activity. So let's not romanticize resuscitation. It's rarely actually works. And
let me stop there, because I really want people to hear that. Resuscitation rarely works.
Rarely works.
Rarely works. And one of the things I always say that shocks people is I always say, do you know the number one failure, why resuscitation actually fails 95% of the time? And they're like, oh, we didn't get there in time. We didn't do this. We didn't do that. I go, no, it's always done on the dead. Like the person has stopped and we're trying to bring them back. No wonder we can't do that very often.
Right. That's
getting I love your word, romanticize.
Yeah.
CPR and resuscitation.
Yeah. So let's not confuse TV with the rest of life. And even more to the point, with most folks who are living with advanced chronic illness, advanced cancers, heart disease, lung disease, et cetera, that the number of successful resuscitation starts approaching zero. It's not just rare, it's almost never. So let's be clear. And the other thing is, it's interesting that person called you in the middle of a resuscitation and put it on you to choose whether to keep going or not. That also smells a little bit like CYA, cover your tail a little bit, or a provider that just didn't want the responsibility themselves, or I'm not sure what, but that is an odd thing to put on a family member on a telephone. I'll say that much.
Right. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and tell people about your amazing book. Tell them where they can find it. I mean, obviously Amazon and everywhere. I was going to show it and I lent my copy out because it's the kind of book you're going to be giving out to people who need it. I know they can also get a free chapter. So tell us how to know more about you and all that good stuff.
Well, thank you, David. It's such a pleasure being with you, bud. It's good to see you, and really a pleasure to be with this big extended family here. So A Beginner's Guide to the End is a book I wrote with Shoshana Berger, me as a clinician, she as a non-clinician. And the book is really meant to be a practical guide, and it will discuss a lot of the things that we've talked about here. And it's meant to be a resource. You can dip in and out of it as needed. And a lot of it has to do with navigating the healthcare system, which is its own bear. So that's A Beginner's Guide to the End. You can order it at any old bookshop. We do have a website for it, and it's just the acronym abgtte.com. And if you reach out to us there, we'd happy to share free chapter and things like that. So that's the book. Simon and Schuster put that out about 1.5 years ago. And then the rest of my work nowadays is I left my academic medical job at UCSF to start a little company called Metal Health, METTLE, metalhealth.com, which is basically online palliative care counseling and coaching. So that's what I'm doing these days, and you can find us there online.
Tell me how people would use that. Is that for the public?
Yes, it is direct. We're trying to sort of
So tell me when I would call you, because I
yeah.
really
So
want people to know this well.
Come to see us at metalhealth.com. You don't need a doctor's referral or anything else. We go around the healthcare system, and we are there for it's direct to consumer as a business. And you come to us like palliative care in the bigger purview. Anytime you're dealing with whether a patient or a family member, if you're struggling to cope with illness or disability, if you're struggling to communicate with your family around illness or communicate with doctors or navigate the healthcare system, or if you're dealing with grief, these are the things that people come to us for, or if you want help going through your advanced care directives. Those are the most common things. Most of our clients end up being caregivers more than patients, but all are welcome. And we also see some clinicians who are burning out and need a safe place to go and vent and talk through things. So go online and you schedule an hour session at a time with us, and that's how we work.
Great, thank you. You are a true gift to the world, and
Yeah.
I really, I so enjoy there is a kindness and a warmth and an empathy that's just in your words, whether they're in your book or here or anywhere you speak. So thank you for being you. Thank you for being you.
No problem. Thank you, David. That's beautiful, especially coming from you. Good to see you too. Thank you, everybody.
Right. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, I'm going to put all his links in all your chats so you will find it. Thanks, everyone. Take care.